Tell me about the world you grew up in.
Are you ready? My name is Keith Dalton. I was born on October 7th, 1932. I was blessed with that name on New Year's Day, 1933. When I was born, Herbert Hoover was still President of the United States until January of 1933, when the election had elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt as President of the United States. I tell you that to let you know that I'm not a spring chicken. Now, I'll tell you some of the things that I remember about my childhood. My dad was always a hard worker, and we learned to work at a very early age. I am amazed today at the amount of trash that Mardene and I take to the trash dump. When I was a kid, we didn't have any trash. We didn't go to the store because we didn't have any money. We didn't know we were poor because everybody was just like us. My mother raised a great big garden with all kinds of vegetables in it, and she canned all those things that we had to eat. We had a couple of peddlers that come into town at the right time. One of them brought berries, the other one brought peaches, and she bottled all those things. And if we had any scraps from the table, they went to the pigs. And once in a while we'd have a can, but our trash was very limited. One of the first things that I remember was when I must have been about 3-4 years old. My mother invited my dad's grandparents, which would have been my great-grandparents, Charles Albert Smith and his wife, and I just barely remember them. And they came, and Mom provided dinner for them, and they were Englishmen. These people would do anything for Brigham Young. They'd have gone anywhere for Brigham Young, just as long as they could take their tea. They had to have tea. So Mother made them tea, and I didn't know what it was, and they were drinking this tea, and I wanted some of it. And I kind of kicked up a stink because I wanted some of that, whatever they were drinking. So they gave me some, and it was the nastiest stuff I've ever tasted in my life. And I spit, and everybody laughed, and I remember that. The summer I was almost 6, my dad took me and put me on a cultivator. It was what we called a lister, and the purpose of it was to throw dirt up around the potatoes, around the bottom of the potatoes, to cover up all the weeds. And we at that time, everybody had a team of horses. He hooked up those horses to that lister and put me on the seat. And all I had to do was sit there. As long as I sit on the seat, the horses would go up one row. They were smarter than I was, and they'd turn around and come back down the next row, and then they got to the bottom, they'd turn around and go up the next row. They knew what they was doing, and those was the longest days. My dad would come and put me on that in the morning early, and then he'd come at noon and unhook the horses. And when you had horses, you had to give them a rest at noon, a couple of hours. So we rested for a couple of hours, and then we went back and we listed potatoes until sundown. And so there was always something to do. And then when the potatoes were harvested in the fall, my dad would take his team with an iron-tired wagon and go up in the hills to get wood to heat the house for the winter. And one time he took me, and my mother put me a big camp quilt around me, and she had a hot water bottle that she put down in the bottom and wrapped me up in that wagon. And if you want to jolt and ride, you want to ride a wagon, iron-tired wagon. I could understand why the pioneers walked. Well, we spent all day and got the wood. After that, I remember my dad going after wood, and we had a screen porch on the south side of our house. And my mother one night, she went out to listen to see if they were coming. Well, they didn't come and didn't come. My dad come finally about midnight. They had tried to cross the canal, the Fox Canal, and it was just sand, and they got stuck. And they doubled up the teams, and they couldn't even pull it out that way. So they had to go back the next morning, and I don't even know how they got the wagons and the wood out of the stuck. But I remember about her listening for them to come. We always had a garden. My mother had a little flock of hens, so we had plenty of eggs. We had a pig, so we had pork. And I remember one of the first things that I can remember is my dad killing the pig. And in those days, I don't know how they skin pigs today. That'd be so fascinating for me to find out, but you cannot skin a pig. So what you do is you take the old pig and dump him in a 50-gallon barrel of hot water, but you have a fire underneath, and you have a tripod that lifts him up and out, and you pull him back up and take a knife, a butcher knife, and scrape him. And every time I shave now, I think about scraping the pig. My mother made soap, and she took lye, and when you killed the pig, you rendered the lard. You took the fat of the pig and you heated it up and got the oil out of it. Then when you made soap, you mixed that with lye over a fire in a barrel outside in the yard. And when it was boiled long enough, then you let it cool. You went out the next day and cut the soap up into soap bars. And we hated to see Saturday night come because we had to bathe on Saturday night. And we hated to bathe. And that old lye soap, by the time you used that lye soap to bathe, why, I'll tell you, you were clean. You were lucky.
Gotta be skin left.
If you had any skin left. And anyway, those are some of the things I remember when I was a kid. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a cattleman up in Antimony, and he told my dad, he says, "You're making a big mistake because you're not teaching your boys how to harness a horse." And I never did. I watched him harness horses, but I never did do it. My dad was progressive, and as soon as he could, he got a tractor. And that old tractor was much faster than the horses for most everything. And I remember when I was in the summer that I was it was 7 years old, nearly 8. Why, we went to the Mangum place, and my dad had to bring the old tractor. Well, the old tractor, the high gear in it would give you 4 miles an hour. You could walk that fast. He put me in the seat of the truck, and he put it in the lowest gear that he had, and he says, "Now drive that home." And Gary was with me. So I stood in the seat, I remember, because I couldn't look over the steering wheel. And we drove the old truck home, and I thought that was great. And that was when I started to drive. When I was 11 years old, Gary and I had the old Jit that was stripped down Model A. We had been up to Birch Creek many times, but this one time when we come down, we got on the highway patrolman caught us, and he took us home, put the old Jit off to the side, took us home, Gary and I, and he told my mother he didn't know whether we ought to be driving that at 11 years old. And if he'd have just known that there wasn't any brakes on it, no lights. Anyway, by the time I was 16 years old, I'd have had 50,000 miles behind me. And on the farm, that's what you did. I got my first 22, I think, when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And so I grew up with guns, hunted rabbits, went with my dad on deer hunts, and that's kind of the life that I had and remember when I was a kid.
Well, I was born in Cache Valley. I was born July the 18th, 1929. I love Cache Valley. Cache Valley was a beautiful little place. We lived in Clarkston. Clarkston was just a small town out of Logan. But people in Logan didn't know where it was. It was only 20 miles away, but they still didn't know where Clarkston was if you were to ask them. Anyway, we enjoyed where we lived. And when I was small, Dad had cows, and we always had to take cows to the pasture. And Grandpa Myler had a horse. And he had a horse, he got her out of the stray pen. Now, if you don't know what that is, they had if the horses got loose or the cattle got loose, and they was bothering somebody else, they'd put them in the stray pen until the person came to get them, the owner came to get them. And if they kept them so long, then nobody claimed them, they'd sell them. Well, Grandpa, they sold Mickey, and so Grandpa bought her, and she was a good pony. And she had a colt, or a little, I guess they call them fillies, that was really fast, could run really fast. And my mom was a good rider, and so was all her sisters. But I wasn't that good a rider. And that kind of scared me when she'd take off. But I was taking cows one day, and two boys from my age came up, one on each side of me, and they were going to do something. And she took off because she thought they wanted to race. And she ran so fast all the way to the pasture. And I was scared to death. I just knew that as she took that turn, I was going to go off with the post. And but I got past that, and I got over to the gate, and she stopped dead still right at the pasture gate, and I still was on. And I just breathed a sigh of relief because I think that I was still on her. But she was a good pony. When I first started to go to school, I was not very good at school. I couldn't read very well. And we didn't know what was wrong or anything. And one day in school, my dad's cousin was there, and he says, and he was watching. And after school was over, he went home and he says, "Ervil," he says, "there's something wrong with Mardene's eyes." He says, "I think you should need to take her to the eye doctor." And so Dad took me to the eye doctor, and he said that the muscles in this right eye weren't working. And so they gave me some glasses, and they told me to play jacks, this ball with the jacks. And I was to do that to get my eye coordinated good. And I'd never read a book until that time. And so when I got my glasses, I started reading, and I just really loved it. And I'd take a book home every night and read it. And there was a rule that you couldn't take books home for other kids, but so they kind of didn't like the idea that I could take a book home, but the teacher knew that I needed to read. And I just kept doing better and better and better. When I got to the 8th grade, my dad told me, "If you'll get to be valedictorian, I'll buy you a watch." Well, I really wanted to watch. So we did everything, and I did my book reports and everything as we went along to get the points I needed. Well, when we added up our scores to see who was going to get valedictorian, I missed it. And I felt so bad, and if I'd have done just 1 or 2 more book reports and I'd read the books, I could have had my watch. And I was so disappointed, but it was kind of a good lesson to me, because I thought, now, you need to do everything, because if you just miss it by a hair, it's kind of sad, So I did a little better after that.
We were really self-reliant, and everybody else was. When I was born, my dad had bought this house just immediately south of me. And I remember telling some of the brethren back in Atlanta, they were talking about how far they had moved in their life, and I said, well, I moved about 50 feet from the place I was born. Anyway, we had, my older brother and sister lived in, and my folks lived in a log house over on what we call the Mangum place. They didn't have any, they had a well, didn't have running water. They didn't have a bathroom. They had an outhouse, and they lived pretty, and everybody in town lived pretty much like that. Their water come out of wells, and later on, when they finally got running water, why, the old wells were a good place to throw all their trash. They filled them up. When we come to this house, we had a row of currant bushes. We had a row of gooseberry bushes. And when the gooseberries would get ripe, we'd go out and pluck the gooseberries. And once in a while, my mother would make jam out of them. We had a little apple orchard. I think there was 4 trees of delicious, red delicious apples. And we always had, my dad always had milk cows. In fact, everybody milked cows, and they put the milk night and morning into a 10-gallon can, and Elton Peterson would come around and pick up the milk. And then there's the old cheese factory house is still down by the river, just as you cross the river bridge going out of town. The white house that's on the north was the cheese factory. And he'd pick up the milk in the morning, and when night come, he would bring your 10-gallon can back with some whey in it. And you took that and give it to the pigs. The pigs really liked the whey. Anyway, my dad had cows, and in those days we didn't have a separator, so he let the milk set overnight in a pan, and he'd skim it off in the morning. And the cream would rise, and we had thick cream. You could spread it with a kitchen knife, and you've never tasted anything as good as bottled raspberries with thick cream on the top. And my mother says that when I was just a little kid, she put me in the bathtub when the water was too hot, and I started hollering for the cream. When I was born in this house over here, my mother had lived there less than a year, and my dad bought the house from Roy. Roy was my grandpa. My grandpa, who was Charlie Dalton. My dad's brother was his youngest brother was Roy, and he lived in this house. And Charlie lived in a big house just south of here, and it probably was the biggest and nicest house in the town. It burned down later on. But anyway, we had a bathtub. It was big enough for a kid to swim in. It was set up on iron feet, and it was cast iron, and we had to heat the water on the stove, so we didn't always have too much hot water. But we had a bathtub, and we had a toilet, and we had a wash basin. We had a bathroom, and other people were still using outhouses. And on Halloween, the big thing was that the kids, the boys in high school would go and tip over everybody's outhouse. So the next morning they had to go and raise the outhouse again. Anyway, I want to tell you about my mother making cheese. You wouldn't have ever known about somebody making cheese, but my dad would bring in the milk and put it in a big number 3 wash tub. And that's a pretty good sized wash tub. And my mother would put it on the back of the cook stove just to keep it warm. In those days, you had a cook stove that was fed by wood, and that served to heat the house, and it also served for cooking, and it had a reservoir in it too. It would hold about 5 gallons of water. You could heat it that way. but we didn't ever have to heat the water. But anyway, she'd take this number 3 wash tub full of milk, and she'd work with it. Then make them. They use rennet or some kind to make the water, the milk coagulate. And I can remember my mother getting her hands down in this tub of milk and going like that to make cheese and made curd. And then she'd take, the whey would rise to the top, so she would take a dipper and skim off the whey. And us kids would sit there and just wait so we could get some cheese curd. And you've never tasted anything as good in your life as some good fresh cheese curd. Now, if you've eaten curd, now I tell you that the curd that we had was much better than that. And then my dad would take the curd after my mom would get off the whey, and he'd take the curd and put it into a ring, a galvanized metal ring that had a plug on the bottom and one on the top. And out on the back fence, that wasn't very far from the back of our house, we had a fence across there, and he put a big long pole, and he fastened one end with a chain, and he made it so that this pole would squeeze the cheese. And he put a bucket of rock on the other end, and he'd leave it there for a couple of days. But when he first put it there, the whey would run out on the ground, but it'd keep running there for a couple of days, and then you'd take it out of the big ring, and you had a big cheese. And it was wonderful. And so we had all kinds of vegetables, but we raised potatoes. We had plenty of potatoes, carrots and beans and corn, and I hated to garden. I had to hoe the vegetables, the corn especially, and I made up my mind that once I got big enough so that somebody didn't tell me I had to hoe corn, I was not going to garden. And when Mardene and I were married, we talked about everything I could think of, but we never talked about gardening. And I was so surprised when Mardene wanted to garden. I never dreamed that she would want to garden. So we gardened all of our lives. And you
didn't
kids,
garden.
No. One time, we had a man come from Salt Lake, and he thought we ought to raise gardens. And that's now when we don't have any gardens around. And he said that up in Salt Lake, why, when they got produce out of their garden, they'd take it down on the corner and people would come and get what they wanted. And he thought we ought to do that in Circleville. And he says, if you want to see a garden, you go around and see what's in Mardene's garden. And I said, well, one thing you won't ever find in Mardene's garden is Keith.
That was true.
They thought that was a pretty good joke, but it's the truth. We were self-sufficient when we were kids, and when we grew up, when I was 9 years old on my way to 10, that summer my dad put me on the tractor. He had bought a hay baler, and I drove the hay baler. When I was 12 years old, Gary was old enough to drive the hay baler, and so I went on the back end to tie wires. In those days, somebody had to punch the wires through, and you had to tie them on the other hand by hand to bale hay. And it was a dusty, hot job, and I figured I tied wires for 13 years. And I guessed about as close as I could guess that in that time I had tied over 300,000 bales. When the war came along and my dad had a baler, and up to that time, the way you put up hay, you had a big hay crew. And you had horses that pulled the wagons, and people had to pitch the hay onto the wagon, and they had somebody to tromp the hay, and then they brought it into the yard, and they rolled it off. We rolled it off. Mardene's dad used derrick, and some people had derricks, but they were awful slow. That was too slow for my dad. But anyway, my mother, when you had the hay crew come to hay, you'd have about a dozen men, and my mother it was expected that you made dinner for them. And I can remember my mother putting the number 3 wash tub out in the sun in the summertime to heat the water. And these guys would come in for dinner. And she had it all spread out on tables outside, and they'd wash in the number 3 wash tub. And then after they ate dinner, they'd go out on the old granary step in the shade, and they'd roll their bull durham. And so it was fascinating to Gary and I to watch those guys roll their cigarettes or old bull durham. And they had the bull durham in sacks, little sacks that had drawstrings on them. And Gary and I'd wait for them to get all of the tobacco out of the sacks. So we'd take the sacks, they'd throw the sacks away, we'd take them and fill them with pretty rocks. Just little kids, you know. But anyway, when the war come along, we had the hay balers, and everybody wanted us to bale hay, because all of the guys that helped the young man who helped to put up hay went to the army. And all of a sudden there was nobody to help. So everybody, they could haul their own hay if they had a hay bale, so they'd come and get us to bale hay.
Well, everybody thought that Grandma was going to be an old maid. They didn't think she was ever going to find anybody. And my dad even kidded me. He'd say, I'd go with a boy that was new, and he'd say, "Oh." And my brother would say, "Well, what's wrong with him?" And say, "Don't his ears match?" And I'd laugh. But that Grandpa, I think he gave up on me. But he looked in the newspaper, he'd see a boy that I'd gone with that was married, and he says, "You know somebody married him." And he'd tease me. And so when I went in the mission field, I didn't hear anything. They didn't tease me there, of course. And Mom said that when Keith got to put in as the second counselor to President McMurrin, she says, I sent his picture home to tell him that he was our new second counselor. Mom says, I got a really funny feeling. And I says, oh. Anyway, he was from down here, clear down here in the state, and I was from Cache Valley, clear up there. We'd never had the chance to meet. But I did know his sister that went to school at Logan. And we both was majoring in the same thing, home economics. And I knew Mona. So when I got out to the mission field, my grandpa and grandma Myler was in the mission field. And they were doing missionary work, and the mission president called them into the mission office to visit with me for a little while before, because he was going to take me to Seattle. And that did, and put me to work up there. So I visited with them that day, and then the next morning I got up and we left for, we were going to Port Angeles eventually. That's where the conference was. So we got as far as Olympia, and then he put me on a bus and sent me to Seattle, and they went on to up the other side of, what is it?
Hood Canal.
Hood Canal, went up the other side and up to Olympia, to Port Angeles. Well, I went and met my companion, and Elder Haskell took us, and he says, we'll pick you up in the morning. And so he picked us up in the morning and took us across the ferry, took us to the ferry, and we went across to Port Angeles. Well, I was sitting there, and President McMurrin got up to talk, and he said, I'm a thief. Do you know what I steal? I steal time.
We hollered it out.
And then when he got to time, he hollered time just as loud as he could. And I jumped and my books fell on the floor. And I was kind of embarrassed. But that's what he intended to do. But anyway, when we got through, when we had a little break, they introduced the elders to me. When this tall, dark elder came along, I says, are you Mona Dalton's brother? And he says, yes. How do you know her? I says, well, I went to school with her. But then I guess he got moved. Well, we had Sunday class for a couple of days, for a couple of times around Green Lake. That was a pretty little lake in Seattle. And then after a couple of weeks, he got transferred to Spokane. And so I didn't see him for a long time. And then they brought him back into the mission home, and I was working there as mission recorder. And they brought him back as second counselor then, and we got to know each other there. But the thing that cinched it was one night it was my turn to vacuum the living room. And Sister, they were quite strict, and I knew that Sister McMurn would need that room vacuumed, and I couldn't get the vacuum to go, and I couldn't find anybody that could do anything about it. So I just sat out on the steps, and I'm wondering what to do. And he came home from a meeting, and he fixed my vacuum cleaner for me, and that's just what I needed. So I went upstairs and told the sisters that he'd make somebody a good husband. And I thought that too, so I married him. When he asked. Of course, I didn't know what he was going to ask. I didn't know how to get him to ask, but that's his part of the story.
Want me to tell a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Well, I knew that Mardene had a strong testimony. And that was awful important to me. She had worked 3 years teaching school, and she financed herself in the mission field. Nobody gave her any money, and well, eventually I ended up going to school. I had one more year of school left when I got out of the mission field, and I was going to school at Utah State when she got home out of the mission field. I thought, well, I'll go over and see her. And I had written her a couple of letters when she was still in the mission field and asked her if she'd go on a date with me. So I had a date with her. I couldn't find out where Clarkson was. I was in Logan, and I had to have my car serviced, and I asked a guy there, I said, where's Clarkson? Oh, I don't know. He said, and he asked somebody else, and finally one guy said, well, I know where Clarkson is. And it's about 20 miles from here, over on the other side of the valley, just right straight across from Logan on the west side. So I went over there, and it was rainy. It was in December. It was between quarters at Christmas time, and so we had a date to go to the movie over in Logan. We went. It was raining when we left, and when we got back, it had snowed about a foot. And Mardene lived up on a hill. So I started to get up the hill. My car had kind of slick tires on it, and nobody plowed the road or anything. I give her the gun and went up the hill. I got within a block of Mardene's place, and she said, we better walk. And I didn't think much a very good date when your date had to walk through a foot of snow to get home. So I said, oh, I can make it. And I backed down and took a run on it the second time. And I didn't get quite as far as I did the first time. We did that about 3 or 4 times. And the time I got through, we were clear down to the bottom of the hill, and I couldn't get past that. So we walked home in the snow. But Mardene had boys bothering her all the time when I got home. And I thought, boy, I need to put a stop to that. So I kept a pretty close tab of Mardene. And finally, and the Army was after me. That's another big, long story, but the guy that was head of the draft board here, he was mad because he had told me that when I went to the mission field, as soon as I got out, he was going to draft me. Well, when I got home from the mission field, nobody knew I was home. I made sure that nobody knew. I got home on a Monday afternoon about 4 o'clock, and I went hunting deer with my brothers the next day, and the next day before the sun come up, I was on the road towards the BYU. I had a friend that registered me at the BYU. I was 2 weeks late, and he had registered me for 18 hours. And holy heck, coming out of the mission field where you're knocking on doors and going into college and a senior in your senior work and taking 18 hours, I thought I was going to end up in the Who's Gal or the Nut House, but I made it. Well, because of the Army, I couldn't finish at the BYU because they had put in a couple of classes while I was gone. So then I transferred to the Utah State. Well, I proposed to Mardene on the first date we had. And that
thought that was so cute.
But the Army was after me, and I didn't know, and she was floored. So we dated for a while. We liked to go to the dance over to the Utah State on Saturday nights, and I told her I took her down to Salt Lake. My dad had a store, and we bought jewelry and stuff for a discount. We went to the jewelry place where they did that. They also had retail, and I told Mardene to pick out a ring. Well, she started looking at rings, and she got to looking at this ring, and all of a sudden she gave it back to him, and I could not figure out what in the heck was going on. We went back to Logan, and I got to thinking about that, and I thought, now there's one way I don't have a lot of time to spend because the Army's after me. So the only way to do that is to get that ring and put it on her, and then she can't say no. So I went back to Salt Lake. I slipped her clasp ring off from her finger, and I went back to Salt Lake and got the ring. And when we went to the dance, and it was in the car and it was dark, I slipped this engagement ring on her. Well, she thought it was her class ring. We went into the dance. We danced a time, 1 or 2 tunes, and all of a sudden, she looked at that ring. Well, we had to go home that night and tell Grandpa and Grandma that we were engaged.
We got married. I had to teach school. I had a job. I'd written to Miss Erickson that was over home economics, and while I was still in the mission field, and asked her if there was a job opening in the middle of the year. And she said, yes, there was one down in, what's the name of the school, Dad?
Oh,
Ben Lomond High School.
Yeah.
And it was a brand new high school. And
in Ogden.
in Ogden, and so she was good to me. She saved me that job, I think, until I got home. And I went down there and taught, and Keith and I got married, and he rode from Ogden up to Utah State. As soon as that was over, we had to go into the Army. We got down there, and there was a department, and the apartments were terrible. They looked like somebody had just taken grease and thrown it around the wall. Big old grease tubs all over. And so we found one that was practically new, an apartment, but it looked about as bad as the others did. And there were bugs all over. So we went to work, and we scrubbed from the ceiling to the floor. And besides the refrigerator and cabinets and everything. We went to bed dog tired that night, and I had to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. And Keith got up and turned the light on, and crunch, 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 all these bugs on the floor. And we were kind of disgusted. We didn't know what to do. So we went looking for some other place. But Keith told Grandpa about it, and he says he'd loan him some. We found a trailer. And Grandpa says he'd loan us the money for the trailer. And so we bought the trailer, and it was a nice trailer. The guy that bought it hadn't lived in it not very long. And so we lived in the trailer park. Now, this is something that it's been important to me all my life. I knew that if I wanted a good husband, I had to be a good girl. And there were girls, my girls were disgusted. They'd go to college, and they'd see a returned missionary come home that they thought was a good boy, and they thought the girls had been harem scarums. But all of a sudden they were good looking, and the boys came home from the mission field, and they were attracted to them, and so all of a sudden the girls were good as gold, and they'd get the good missionary. And Lisa was really disgusted sometimes. She says, "Can't they see some of those things?" And I says, "Well, I guess they can't. I guess that's one of the things that you have to sense spiritually." And I think it can't be just once here and there, not spotty. It has to be continually. And I think if a girl lives in a good home where parents are good and they're kind to each other, everybody's kind to each other, I don't think they could help but be a good person. And that's what I'd like my girls to be.
There's some advice I would like to give. The Lord give you the opportunity to be baptized, which is absolutely essential, and then you receive the gift of the Holy Ghost when you're made a member of the church. Learn how to use it when you get ready to find a companion. Learn to fast and pray about it. That's what the Lord give you the gift of the Holy Ghost for. And you forgive me, but you need to learn in your life how to use the gift of the Holy Ghost. That's what the Lord wanted you to do, and there's a way to do that. You need to study a little bit and learn how to to use the gift of the Holy Ghost to make your decisions, you know, especially your important decisions in your life. There's just no better way. So it don't matter whether you're a man or a woman. The first thing you need to do is to learn as far as the Lord is concerned, what your role is. I see one of the things that disturbs me a great deal is to see women who want to take the role of the man of the priesthood. Learn how the Lord intended for the priesthood to be used. And then, if you're a man, you play your role. And that's not hard to find out. In fact, most of it's told to you in the proclamation on the family. The brethren tell you what is expected of the man and what's expected of the mother. And the Lord didn't intend for a man to be a woman, and he never intended a woman to be a man. It's important that each one of you play the role that the Lord intended for you to do, and then your kids will turn out. Now, in the priesthood, the secret to life and eternity is patriarchal order. Now, very few people understand and know what that means. I was in a temple wedding one day, observing a temple wedding, and the man who was doing the marrying, he said, "Today we begin a new patriarchal family." I hadn't thought about that. And that was impressive to me. And that's what it's all about. Because that's what you do here on the earth, is learn how to be a patriarch to your family. And how, with your wife, how to be a patriarchal family. Because that carries over into eternity. And that's what the Lord wants you to learn when you're to learn how to magnify your calling. That's what it's all about. You know that the Savior performed the atonement. The atonement was absolutely necessary. And I don't understand it. I have tried to comprehend it all my life. There's almost a witness to everything in the gospel and what the Savior did. But when it comes to the atonement that was performed in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that was the important part, there really was no witness, except maybe for the Father and the angels. Because Christ went into the garden alone, where he performed the atonement for the forgiveness of sins. And people don't understand mercy. You'll hear people sing songs about mercy, and you'll see, if you remember one song that says, "He'll always forgive." Well, the Lord is only able, because of the law that he lives by, to forgive sins of people who earn that right. And then he can extend his mercy to them because of the atonement. But if you ignore the commandments, you don't earn the right for the Lord's mercy. Now, if you go to other religions, they have a lot to say about Christ on the cross. And what Christ did on the cross was very important. but they don't understand what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. And none of us really understand it, except that we know that he suffered more than any human being ever could. And he performed the atonement. And the Lord said that you need to teach your kids by the time they're 8 years old what it means as much as you can. They need to understand that their baptism is a sacred thing. And then boys need to understand that there's a mission in their future. You can't start to telling a kid when he's 18 and 19 years old he ought to go on a mission. You have to prepare for that. You tell a kid that there's a mission in his future. You start him with a piggy bank. That's for his mission. And then you tell him if if he'll save his money after he's paid his tithing, that you'll give him as much as he saves. You'll give that much more for his piggy bank, and all that's for his mission. I think it's important. My dad set aside money for each of his grandsons, and they understood it was for a mission. And I've tried to do the same thing. And my grandsons know that even though it wasn't a lot, that there was money. That their grandfather knows the importance of a mission, and that their money set aside for their mission, even though it won't near cover it, but that's what it's there for. I don't know a better way for a boy to learn how to exercise his priesthood and what's important in life than to go on a mission. And it'll give you an education you just can't get anywhere else. And of course, your college education is just as important. And once you get out of high school, the next 10 years are the most important of your life. All the doors are open to you when you're young and you graduate from high school. And after 10 years, your life is set, and you'll see that the doors start to close. And you can't make a decision about what you're going to do in life when you're 30 years old. You got too many doors that are closed to you. So get a mission behind you, so you learn how to discipline yourself and learn what's important, and then get home and get your education so that you can afford a family. The next big education in your life is raising kids. And once you learn how in this life, I think the Lord had a reason for you to raise a family. You learn how to raise a family because that's what you want to do all through eternity. You have to realize that the glory of God is his children. And if you ever have any glory, it's going to be your children. It's all about family and patriarchal order, and learn in your life to learn to push yourself and learn how to discipline yourself and how to make a family work. And that carries off into eternity, and that's what the heck you're on this earth for. No. Now, I've lived longer than most people that are on this earth. There's been an awful lot of people that lived, born and died since I was born, and I've been around the block a few times. And pay attention to what I'm telling you.
That's one thing, we've had the same goals in life. And that's made it easy to work together. It's awful hard when you see a couple that are going in different directions.
Mardene and I...
That's another thing. When you have a family, you have to pull together. You have to be the same. A kid can't ask, one of your children can't ask you something and you say yes and have your husband say no. When you do that, it doesn't mean anything. It just washes everything out. It's not important. And Keith's always been good to stand by me. If I told one of the kids no, then he stood by me. And I think that was one of the things that helped us.
Mardene and I our goal was to send our boys on missions. We sat down and had some goals when we got married, but since Mardene had failed a mission too, we used to talk about our missions, and I'll be dipped if we didn't have 3 girls
That wanted to go.
that failed missions. We had, our oldest daughter went to London, our next daughter went to Madrid, Spain, our next daughter went to Italy, Kendall, the oldest boy, went to Argentina, and Dal went to Japan, and because Wade had cancer, they wouldn't send him out of the country. He went to Washington, D.C., Spanish speaking. But
Satisfied him, and he was.
we've been awful glad to send kids on missions.